Welcome to Professor's Corner. I'm having a conversation with Melissa on applied ethics and public policy, and in this session we're going to focus on the normative theory called Deontology, or the theory that was put forward by Immanuel Kant. Now, the key feature in this theory is that its focus is on the motive or the reason for action. It does not attach significance to the consequence of the action. So in this sense, it is quite different, I would say diametrically opposed to utilitarian or consequentialism that we look at. Melissa, to get underway on this, I think what I'd like to do is just sort of contrast, if I could, the religion and morality, at least as what Kant thought he was doing, because one of the things we're going to notice as we go through his theory is he places a high view upon persons, not necessarily human persons, but on persons. And we're going to want to be talking about that, and we're going to find there's some affinity with the way in which Christianity places significance on the sanctity of human life in persons. Okay, so what I'd like to say is that this idea, the dignity of human beings, really began as a religious notion. And and that had to do with the fact that God has redeemed us and we're created in God's image. And hundreds of years were built around the individual having that worth, for good and bad, because there was slavery going on and things like that. But by and large, people were, attending to that. We come to Kant, and he appreciates this high status that's given to human beings. But he tries to tear it away from its theological framework.
Okay.
That's what I mean by matrix theory, in that he saw the notion, the idea, the platitude of respect for life.
Yes.
And though it might have been being spoken about more like sanctity of life because it was a theological framework around respect for life, he wanted to talk about respect for persons. He thought he could preserve the dignity and worth of human beings apart from its theological framework.
Okay.
And so I give you a quote here. I'm not going to go into it, but I wanted to give you the primary source of where that doctrine emerges. So with Kant, in a way, he's replacing God with an autonomous reasoning being who can reason in a very sophisticated way. She can reason. They're persons. It's not their human beingness that they're in a part of the Homo sapien community. It's not that they have bodies. It's almost their disembodied mind that is being valued by Kant. And so in some regards, Kant has been characterized as creating the God-man, so to speak, or the man-God, I should say. And that's part of the relationship. But it's all about trying to preserve the dignity of human beings apart from the theological framework. So let's take a look at how this all takes place by looking at a couple versions of his categorical imperative. And
before we do that, I've heard the term categorical imperative. Can you just elaborate on what that means?
Well, if we have, it means to operate independently of or regardless of desires and wants and consequences. It means to formulate a principle that is reason-based, and that you act in devotion to that reason and that motive alone.
Okay.
And you, irregardless of what the consequences are. That's what we're really looking at when we talk about this. So, and I just want to say to the other students here that are joining the conversation, what we're trying to do is pick out aspects of these theories in a way that when you're reading through the textbook on Bloom, Ethics and Public Policy, you're seeing some terms he's using, and I'm trying to give you just a little more elaboration on the theory. And so we're focused on the theory and not always on its application to public policy issues. You'll get that through the book. Okay, so we know a categorical imperative is a maxim that we generate ourselves.
Yes, and we're going to operate in order to be consistent with that principle, and no matter the cost.
No matter the cost.
Whereas, This is different.
Now,
Okay,
for
then
Kant, he had an objective morality, unlike modern day Kantians that no longer maintain an objective morality. He did. He thought there was a moral law that was objective, and the categorical imperative was a reasoning process that everybody could, or he hoped that everybody could, or thought everybody could if they wanted to, step into that mindset, and through that reasoning process subjectively could apprehend the objective moral law. Today, people don't buy that metaphysics, that there's an objective moral law, so all you're left with is a concept known as universalizability.
Okay.
What would you do if everybody did it?
Okay. Are there any other principles?
Well, let's look at that one, and then the second expression of the categorical imperative is what's called the principle of humanity.
Okay.
So let's just focus real briefly on the principle of universalizability. Kant, there's the primary source here, act in accordance to the maxim through which you can at the same time will that it would become a universal law. Kant is thinking that moral laws are like physical laws. That's the sort of the worldview that the culture that he's in at that time, and that they cannot be broken. And so you create a law like, let's say, lying.
Yes.
That it's wrong to lie.
Yes.
Right? So he posits a scenario in which he can think of that everybody, if everybody lied, there'd be a contradiction. Mm-hmm. Nobody would believe anybody. You couldn't have contracts. So that can't be universalized. But you could universalize everybody telling the truth.
Right.
That became his absolute.
Okay. So
you think about Corrie ten Boom, for example. I know this isn't exactly right, but he posited where a murderer would show up at the door and say, "Hey, are you harboring somebody?" And the person at the door had to, if they were a Kantian, had to tell the truth and relinquish.
Right.
I think about this in what in Corrie ten Boom and the challenges that she had with the Nazis.
Her sister particularly her sister was operating under that belief that you told the truth no matter what.
That's right.
And that created some tensions, because if that's a situation where someone's going to die because you told the truth, it becomes stakes are higher.
Now, the other principle he has, and it's related to this, is the principle of humanity.
Okay.
And here's how they connect. The principle of humanity says, so act that you use humanity, whether in your own person, so you take into account your own self in a certain regard, not your desires, but once we get this law, you take into account your own person or that of another, always as, at the same time, an end and never as a means. Do you understand what I mean by end and means?
Yes.
You can't
means
manipulate
is the
people.
process, end is the result.
You can't manipulate people. You have to treat them. So you have wants and desires. I have to recognize that. I have wants and desires. You have to recognize. We have to figure this out. And that's
Our
what
want and desire can't overweigh the person.
That's right. And the categorical imperative, in effect, strips us away. Your wants and desires, my wants and desires. We get to where we can posit a rational law.
Yes.
And then you obey it, I obey it. And it's not me always trying to posit the law. It's everybody trying to think the same way. Mm-hmm. So what gives us our humanity principle, version 2, is our ability to universalize expression 1 of the categorical imperative. So they're really one and the same.
Okay.
It's what makes humanity is a great dignity and worth that he was trying to preserve from Christianity, but in a secular framework. The secular framework is that human beings have this capacity to universalize. Does that make sense?
I think it does.
So the two are really flip sides of the same coin.
Okay. And what is humanity?
So in this case, humanity is just your ability to reason, not your body, not your desires. It's just that you're able to formulate these universal laws, like always tell the truth, never take an innocent life. And and that was for him what the objective moral law was. Today, basically, there's no objective moral law, so it's the fact that we utter it, and when we utter it, we have to be consistent with our utterances, our statements. And so ad hominem argument, or is all we see out there is the argument of hypocrisy.
And does each human, it's part of the reason that we can make them our end goal, that somehow, I know he doesn't have God in the mix, but somehow we have some value.
And that value is the ability to universalize.
Okay.
That's what that we can do that uniquely of any other species makes us of high importance, of supreme importance. That's what I'm back to a moment ago, where I'm trying to tie together the ability to universalize. is what gives you your dignity. If you don't have that ability to universalize, you have no dignity, and you don't have to treat somebody as an end, you can treat them as a means.
Right.
Case in point. Anencephalitic children
Right.
can't universalize.
Right.
They don't have no moral worth in,
Right.
in Kant's view.
Got
They
it.
don't have it in the utilitarian view
So
either.
as a Christian, we're still going to struggle with Kant.
That's
But-
because that's right, because the difference between the utilitarian and the consequentialist, or I'm sorry, the utilitarian, the consequentialist, and Kant, is that they valued experiences. Kant values the bearer of experiences, and we're going to have a different metaphysical interpretation of the bearer of experience.
Okay. Well, are there any problems with this principle of humanity?
Well,
maybe we're kind of getting into those in
we
a way,
are.
right?
We
We're
really have already. So let's just highlight some of the things we've already said.
Yeah.
And get back to it, because I think you listen to this. I don't know about you. I get a little uncomfortable with this theory. We started out with it looked pretty good, and now
Yes.
you're starting to think, I don't know.
Right, because I'm thinking to myself, I know plenty of individuals who might not be able to reason in this way, but I think their life has meaning and
Can
value.
you see the difference to this high level of reasoning and say the consequentialist sort of sentient type of being that just reasons means to an end?
Yes,
Yeah.
Kant's raising the bar in terms of what humans have to be able to do.
What they can universalize in terms of the end.
Right,
They were largely the sentient. It was just, I'll figure out based on my wants what my end is, and I'll just figure my means to get there. Kant's saying, no, we have to universalize about what that end is.
Right.
That's a much more difficult task, much more sophisticated. So yeah, so one of the problems with humanity is it's treating the end is somewhat vague, and it's difficult to apply. And I already said,
Right.
if you say to, in this case, they coincide. If you say to a Kantian and you say to a utilitarian, what would you do about a child that's 1 month old?
right,
All right, in their theory, does that mean you could terminate that life? Well, of course they'd say no, 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 but they'd have to figure out a reason to that, because their theory says, well, the neonate doesn't have this ability to universalize.
Right.
They're not exactly sentient in the way the universal, so they don't carry any moral worth.
Right.
Now they have a way around this. They would never allow this, but we see that their theory could pull them in that direction. Okay, so that's one problem. It's vague. Another problem is it fails to give us good advice, because at least in the contemporary setting, we're left with consistency. And so as long as I'm consistent, like let's take the concentration. If you said, is it right to gas the Jews?
right,
The Nazi could say yes. And would you prepare, if you were a Jew, to gas yourself? And he could say yes,
right,
right? So he's been consistent.
right.
But we still have a real problem with this.
Yes, we do.
That's all that the argument from consistency gets us to, or the ad hominem argument gets us to, is as long as you're consistent with what you utter and apply it to yourself, you've done what's right.
Right.
That's a good policy.
It is a good policy.
Okay, so it's vague. It doesn't give us advice that treats people the way we actually think they should be
Sure.
in cases. The other is that this autonomous being, we may not have this level of
We're going
universality.
to have levels of bias. We're going to have things that are blocking our ability.
And
to
maybe some
control.
of our desires are good things to have.
Right. We may not need to totally pull those out, excise those.
Exactly. So the idea of a genuinely autonomous person that does nothing regardless of consequences, desires, but just acts on it. The interesting thing about Kant, in the same book that he wrote about this, he says, I don't think that these autonomous individuals, they're very minimum. I think they're pretty rare. They're just ideals.
Yeah.
So he even knew
That this was unusual, and you're not going to have many people who can actually operate at this level.
exactly, but that you should have Kant used in contemporary bioethics debates or
Yeah.
human rights debates. They want to give dignity to the human person without acknowledging sort of the Christian background.
Right.
It seems interesting that in that context it's okay, but Kant himself said, these are very slimming. In order for their human right to be founded on the way it is, you'd have to have an autonomous being that acts this way all the time.
Yes, and that's not going to
And
fully
that's not
work.
going to happen. No.
And we've already hit on the problem that there's some individuals who aren't going to be able to reason, and they're going to be even at the lowest levels of reasoning
Exactly.
ability, and those folks are going to be excluded. And then if you're going to exclude those folks, well, you start getting into a nebulous sphere of animals and how do they play into
For
it.
Kant, for Kant, unlike the utilitarians, animals would have a justification because they can be sentient. For Kant, they're not.
Yes.
So there's a case in which on abortion they come together, the two theories, but on animals they go apart.
Right.
But you know what I'd like to do in concluding? I want to make sure that you understand how this would apply as a policy specialist.
Great.
So let's just look at the three basic simple steps. First, you'd have to formalize this maxim.
Yes.
Now, we haven't practiced this other than, can you lie? No, you can't. Can you tell the truth? Yes, you can.
Okay.
But it's really much more hard than that. And when you're reading the literature, you're going to read about people trying to formulate that maxim for you.
Difficult.
And that's what you're learning about, how the Kantian is applying to a public policy issue.
Okay.
So first you formulate that maxim that everybody could operate under. Then you imagine the world where that maxim is being applied.
Yes.
And if it seems to work,
it's got to be realistic.
Then if it seems to work, then that becomes the universal law. That becomes the moral law. And then you ask a question of that, can the goal of my action be achieved in such a world? In other words, can we achieve this? Is it realistic to achieve this? And if those three things come together, then you've got the policy. And that's what people develop these sort of separately, scholars, and then they apply them to public policy. And what we're going to be reading in here is how they work through these processes in order to come up with that categorical imperative that applies. And what you're going to find is this theory is used a lot in things like human rights.
Okay.
It's used it's not used so much in economics.
Okay.
It's used in issues of war and terrorism. So
it's going to work in some cases and it's not going to work in others.
That's right.
We still need another theory.
We need a theory.